So I just want to thank you all for taking the time to be here this morning so early. I wanted to thank Gary and Hannah and Noam for bringing us all here to this beautiful place. Welcome to Remaking Globalization. So my name is Farah Stockman. I am a journalist with the New York Times, and I am an American, which means I grew up with a map that had the United States in the center of it, even though that meant cutting Russia and China off, right? Americans, I think, are not very psychologically prepared to not be the center of everything. I was raised to believe that the neoliberal secret sauce that made my country rich was gonna make every country rich, right? We were told that if American capitalism doesn't make you rich, you're not doing it right. Even those of us who critique the neoliberal project as a hegemonic project that isn't necessarily good for everybody else, we still don't always see the ways in which other countries have resisted this project. We haven't always looked at how Russia and China and India just basically didn't buy into it from the very beginning. And we haven't learned very much, at least I myself didn't know very much about the ways that countries in Latin America and Africa are reclaiming control over their finances. And so that's what we're kind of gonna learn about today. We have this great panel here who are gonna talk about what we can learn from the Global South about tools to reassert control over the economy. Yesterday, Jayati made this comment about chaos and how she was optimistic in times of chaos because that is the time when countries that have been oppressed can actually get out from under the rules that have been oppressing them. And so we're gonna learn a little bit about that and see whether some of these tools that are being pioneered in the Global South can actually be used by the rest of us to kind of come up with an alternative to Trumpism and the sort of the right wing the right-wing project that's going on right now. So today we have Stephen Link, who's a historian of global, Stefan Link, a historian of global political economy at Dartmouth College. His book, Forging Global Fordism, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Contest Over the Industrial Order, retells the story of the US auto industry, not as one of individual ingenuity, but state competition. He also is the author of an essay called How Might the 21st Century Deglobalization Unfold? Some historical reflections. So he's gonna set the table for us, talking about the last cycle of globalization and deglobalization and what we can expect going forward. We have also Natalya Naqvi. She's an assistant professor of international political economy at the London School of Economics. Her research focuses on the political economy of finance and development. She has a book under contract with Oxford that looks at conditions under which countries that have previously liberalized are now reasserting control over finance, and she's gonna tell us about the really incredible case of Bolivia. We also have Jazmin Sierra, who is assistant professor of political science. She's a faculty fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame. And she's gonna talk about the case of Brazil, which uses, it's a very interesting case of using a state bank to foster a national champion, creating the world's largest meat company. Is that it? Yes. I mean, I learned a lot when preparing for this. And then we have Marcos Nobre, who is a professor of political philosophy at the University of Campinas. He's a senior researcher and former president of the Brazilian Center of Analysis and Planning in Brazil, and he's a frequent contributor to Phenomenal World. And he's gonna kind of bring us home with, I don't know, pessimism or optimism but he's going to talk about what sort of the reshaping of the global economic order means for the global South and the North, and we're going to then have sort of, after their presentations, we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So, Stefan, can you set the table for us here?
Yeah, sure. So, is this on? Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thank you, Farah. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to try and set the table by addressing a question that Noam and Gary circulated to us in the run-up to this panel, and that question was, what have neoliberals gotten wrong about the politics and economics of globalization? And as a historian, I'll reflect on this a little bit from a historical perspective. Sorry?
Put the mic closer.
Can you, is this better? Is this? All
Yeah,
right,
maybe
all right,
move it.
all right. Yeah, that's better. So,
Can you hear me back?
what have neoliberals gotten wrong about the politics and economics of globalization? I want to make 3 points. They've gotten the term itself wrong. They've gotten the history wrong. And third, I think they've failed to recognize the foundational and constitutive role that states have played in the world economy since the 19th century, both in the process of globalization and the process of deglobalization. So first, the term. I just want to remind everyone that globalization as a term is a period piece. The boom of globalization discourse dates to the 1990s and early 2000s. You know this. It's not coincidentally the moment of Western post-Cold War triumphalism and the Washington Consensus, where it seemed that all systemic alternatives to stylized, kind of stylized ideal of a free market capitalism, so both global South developmentalism and real existing socialism appear to have failed, the end of history. So it seemed plausible, this came up yesterday already, it seemed plausible to argue at this moment, and I think we should appreciate that as a particular historical moment, it seemed plausible to argue then that the future would bring a convergence towards Western-style democracy and liberal capitalism, and it also seemed plausible to argue that this process could be governed technocratically through international organizations like the WTO. Because of this origin of the term, I think the very term, it's less a term, it's kind of like a meta-concept that organizes all sorts of ways of thinking about the process and the structure of the global economy. So it has certain assumptions and meanings baked into it that one should properly call ideological. So globalization was seen in this moment as a process that was benign, progressive, indeed natural, not only broadly desirable, but essentially inevitable. I just want to share with you one telling quote from Clive Crook, then at The Economist, today works for Bloomberg, who some 20 years ago called globalization, and I quote, a natural economic process which can only be reversed, if at all, when policies are deliberately framed to that end. A few years later, Barack Obama counseled college graduates to, quote, stay global, because globalization is here to stay and it's not going away. One could go on. Hillary Clinton said similar things. After 2008, what complemented this was sometimes a commitment to, a concern for the so-called losers of globalization who needed to be compensated, perhaps. But the process, the notion of the process remained the same: desirable, inevitable, and if left to its own devices, bound to intensify and spread in self-generating fashion. So this was the kind of ostensibly sophisticated common sense that reigned supreme. Just to remind everyone, this is not too long ago. It also explains the blithe faith, right, in shock therapy prescriptions in Eastern Europe, and the notion, this came up yesterday already too, very prevalent in the 1990s, that if you sign China into the World Trade Organization, there would be regime change in Beijing. Of course, in this view, the opposite, so-called deglobalization, can only be conceptualized as a backlash, a term that belongs, I think, to this conceptual universe. A backlash resulting from deeply misguided politics, protectionist fallacies, populist temptations, incapacity to understand basic trade economics, et cetera, et cetera. So when we use this dyad, globalization, deglobalization, do we accept terms that push us to think in terms of economic and cultural convergence, mutual advantage, technocratic governance, and a moralistic view of politics? I think we should ask that question. The very terms seem to point away from the questions we should be asking, which are about political contestation over the world economic order. So I'm not sure what the alternatives are. I think it's telling that currently geoeconomics is making a comeback as a term that comes out of the 1980s, interestingly. It's a bit pretentious, but I think at least it points in the right direction. It points towards political conflict. Or we simply revert back to somewhat lamely, less flashy, but descriptive international political economy. One cannot legislate language, obviously, but I wouldn't be surprised if globalization as this meta concept would go eventually the way, as a term, would go the way of modernization. So as a term whose ideological baggage has become so obvious to make it analytically almost useless. And that brings me to my second point. So inevitably, high globalization gave rise to a kind of historical origin story, a useful past if you want, and variations of this have in the last 25 years been repeated over and over again in books, podcasts, seminar rooms, policy papers. And you're familiar with this. This potted history goes something like this. So for the first time in the 19th century, there arose a genuinely global market worthy of its name. Based on technological achievements such as railroads, steamships, the telegraph, etc., the 19th century world economy drew an unprecedented range of regions into a single market characterized by price convergence and increasingly, unprecedentedly multilateral trade. And this was globalization 1.0, or the first age of globalization. Then, alas, hypercharged national rivalries precipitated a world war, interrupting this first age of interconnection, which reached its depths in the depression of the 1930s. Borders enforced, trade barriers raised, lending slow to trickle, eventually another world war. Only after 45, now guaranteed by American hegemony, did globalization resume. It was a slow process. In fact, trade regained pre-1914 levels only in the 1970s, measured as a percentage of global GDP. Capital flows had to wait until the 1990s to retain that level. This is when we reached globalization 2.0. And after 2008, many began fretting that another deglobalization was underfoot, and this was at all costs to be avoided, since we all know how that went the first time around in the 1930s. A kind of moralistic story. It illustrates the issues, I think, that I pointed out at the beginning. It's a narrative that supports the idea of this as a self-activating, self-expanding process, that political resistance to it was politically dubious and potentially catastrophic. Of course, there are grave empirical problems with this history. Just point out one. The construction of global markets in the 19th century was a deeply political process. It was hardly self-generating. What did historians call the late 19th century before it became globalization 1.0? They call it the age of empire. So only by drawing on the military and juridical powers of imperial states could global markets, in fact, emerge. And this is how they emerged in the 19th century. Hinterlands had to be refashioned as suppliers of cash crops. Classic case is India. Here, the British imperial state built the necessary infrastructure, refashioned property relations, and imposed contract law in order to make this colony into a dependable source of raw cotton and a consistent importer of Lancashire cloth. So global markets had to be politically constructed. They're not self-generating. The other big problem with this history is that it's one-dimensional. It kind of presumes that the only metric we have to think about is some amorphous version of interconnection, so that you can say there's more or less globalization. When in fact, I think what we need to understand is that different eras of globalization have had very different political architectures built into it. If we jump forward to the latest phase, neoliberal globalization proper, the wager here was that the political architecture of the world economy could be subsumed into a single set of apolitical rules. This was different from the kind of imperial globalization of the 19th century. And the most pristine expression of this idea was the World Trade Organization, which is meant to create a level playing field of laws and regulations that would allow private corporations and, as Jayati reminded us yesterday, lenders, so banks, to move in and out of national jurisdictions with minimal friction and political interference. This meant, in practice, wide-ranging and intrusive stipulations to change domestic laws and regulations. So note the bifurcation of the ideology, something that is supposedly self-generating, actually relied on deeply intrusive institutional and legal changes. So convergence, not self-generating, but intrusive. And that leads to my third point. So the idea that this could work, I think, in hindsight, is clear, was, I think, always untenable. Because it's based on a deep misunderstanding of how states operate in the world economy. So one might step back and think about this from a long-term global historical perspective. So like global markets, the system of nation states that structures the world today is a legacy of the 19th century. And this is not a coincidence, but rather the result of a single process. As many thinkers in a kind of Polanyian vein have pointed out, market logics provoke political structures that confer the ability to manage them, or at least attenuate their fallout. So the key capacities of states, territorial control, boundary policing, taxation, capital controls, tariffs, et cetera, they're instruments of economic management that are, if you want, baked into the DNA of what modern states are. They are, if you want, part of their ontology. That means that states never relinquish, and we shouldn't be surprised if currently they are reasserting their ability to engage strategically and situationally with global markets for goods and capital. And of course, the ability to do so is very unevenly distributed, but I think another spin on understanding this is if we think of neoliberal globalization as also a state strategy, namely that of the hegemon, right? So the multilateralism of the 1990s, neoliberal globalization, was not simply the brainchild of neoclassical economists working at the IMF, developing the Washington Consensus. It also, and this is often forgotten, reflected the very hard-nosed open-door policy of an American hegemon that after some jitters in the 70s and 80s had regained the undisputed lead in the then cutting-edge sectors, telecom, aerospace, software design, finance, engineering, et cetera, so smoothing the playing field across the globe, right, for corporations and lenders, of which the US ones were the most powerful, was then considered a main plank of what was called American economic security. So neoliberal globalization was, in that sense, also a mercantilist policy, right? Precisely because of this, it was only ever going to prevail as long as US political and economic dominance was in question, which it no longer is. One example that came up yesterday that I'll just mention is obviously China's accession to the World Trade Organization, which for all intents and purposes was strategic. It opened up the consumer markets of the West to China's exports, but the intrusive stipulations were treated very cavalierly by Beijing, or the provincial developmental sub-states that are operating in China. This wasn't part of a master plan, but it's clear that China never relinquished political control over the process of so-called liberalization. But beyond that, there's an entire history, and I think we'll hear more about it on this panel, this absolutely fascinating and understudied of how comparatively weaker nation states have made use of the often limited leverage that they have had to manage external economic relations. So to sum up, 3 points. I think globalization is a period concept whose utility it may have, whose utility we may be outliving. We'll see. Second, a historical perspective obviously shows very luridly that globalization is not self-generating, but the result of dedicated and sustained political artifice. And third, the assertion of state authority over markets has been the historical norm rather than the exception. So I would suggest this, we should grapple a little bit more, I think, than we do with the fact that states are the institutions that shape the political architecture of the global economy. Any realistic post-neoliberal agenda, I think, should accept this fact and reflect on it. I was struck very much yesterday in the conversations already at this conference how this very fact seems to be accepted in a matter-of-fact way. Talk about digital sovereignty. The question arose, isn't it a problem when capital is more powerful than the nation state? Who disciplines capital? We're talking about disciplining capital. It's the state. So I think one of the things that we might be doing here is accept this as a fact, work it up analytically, and perhaps work on something like a normative rehabilitation of state capacity, and where the sources of this normative rehabilitation could be, I think, is a pressing question. So thank you.
All right. Well, so that sets us up for Natalya to talk about Bolivia.
Hi, can everyone hear me at the back? Sorry, my voice, no? Okay, I'll try and speak a bit louder, but my voice is not great. Okay, so a lot of the academic literature looks at how financial globalization constrains what the nation state can do and constrains, industrial policy and so on. But today I wanted to talk about the opposite. So under what conditions previously liberalized developing countries can actually overcome these constraints. And I'm interested in how the structure of the international system, which has been transformed by globalization, how that constrains or enables states to pursue kind of state-led development more generally and state intervention in the financial sector more specifically. One of the main questions that motivates this is whether the famous East Asian developmental state model that we all know about, whether this is still relevant today after economic globalization. So my current research project, it's in the form of a book, the book that Farah mentioned. So this focuses on how much policy space is still available in the era of globalization for developing countries to pursue what I call interventionist or developmentalist financial policies. And this is where the state intervenes sectorally in the process of credit allocation. And it does this through tools such as state-owned banks, which Jazmin is going to talk about, directed credit programs, or interest rate and credit controls on private banks. And the purpose of these kind of tools is to direct resources towards priority sectors or firms that are considered vital for long-run development, but that might not receive the resources that they need on private markets alone. And these kind of directed credit policies are usually also accompanied by conditionalities on the recipient firms, which policymakers then use to steer investment decisions in accordance with their industrial policy objectives. So in this sense, I call this renationalizing the financial sector, but it doesn't necessarily mean bank nationalization or anything like that. It just means that can be one of the tools, although it's not a very commonly used tool anymore, but it just means reasserting kind of state public control and direction of the financial sector to use it for kind of national public purpose. So there's a perception that developing country policymakers are kind of really strongly constrained by all of these external forces like direct or indirect liberalization conditionalities by bilateral external creditors. So that's mainly the IMF and the World Bank with their financial liberalization conditionalities, but also bilateral external creditors. There are also international market pressures from portfolio investors and credit rating agencies, and these have, of course, increased exponentially with financial globalization. So for instance, if interventionist financial policies lead to a credit rating downgrade, then this would trigger capital flight and have kind of very devastating economic consequences. And these things are very real, right? So this is all true that these external constraints do exist. But in my research, I I find that actually opposition by domestic actors, and especially the domestic private financial sector, is equally as important as these external constraints. And some of these external constraints have actually loosened recently, which I'll get to in a second. And so the main kind of contribution of this research to this debate about globalization and policy autonomy is to show that although there are these strong external constraints, developing countries aren't just completely passive victims of globalization, but within a set of outer structural constraints, they do actually have some agency to conduct interventionist policies if the domestic politics motivates them to do so. So I don't have any slides, but if we look at kind of recent trends in interventionist financial policies, so if we look at things like bank privatization, credit controls, like financial liberalization indices, we all know that there was like this very strong liberalization trend during the 80s and the 90s, almost universally across the board. But actually, since the 2000s, that's not what's been happening. There's been much greater variation in national financial policy since the 2000s. So financial liberalization has slowed, and some countries have actually reversed some of these reforms. So this is kind of the empirical puzzle that motivates my research. Like, why is there this greater variation in national financial policy since the 2000s compared to what was going on in the 1980s and 1990s, where you had this near universal financial liberalization trend? So the kind of research question in my book project is, under what conditions do previously liberalized developing countries reassert state control and implement developmentalist financial policies despite all of these external constraints that I just spoke about? So on the systemic level, during the 80s and 90s, IMF and the IMF, World Bank, and kind of what's called in the literature like traditional finance or Western finance, with its associated liberalization conditionalities, was the primary external financing source, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was really no outside option at this time, and that explains why you had this near universal liberalization trend. But since the early 2000s, that's completely changed. That's no longer the case. So I mean, first, one of the most striking structural shifts in external development finance is the rise of what are called non-traditional bilateral lenders. So that's large emerging market countries, but really China in particular, that has become one of the most important sources of external development finance. And because this kind of finance doesn't come with the same kind of policy condition, it does come with conditionalities, of course, but it doesn't come with financial liberalization conditionalities. So it's become a serious alternative to traditional sources of finance like the IMF and the World Bank. And then since the early 2000s, cyclical factors have also been really important. So historically low interest rates in the core countries have meant that there's a lot of kind of financial investors in these core countries looking to move abroad in search of higher interest rates, and especially into emerging markets. So this triggered this kind of global financial boom, which lasted, approximately from 2003 to 2013 and still persisted after that. And this meant that financial market discipline was loosened during this time because financial investment was coming in kind of no matter what the countries were doing. Like it was not fleeing in response to interventionist policies. And this private finance also, although it comes with kind of these market pressures and so on, it doesn't come with formal financial liberalization conditionalities attached. So this also kind of presented another outside option to traditional IMF and World Bank loans. And then finally, driven partly by a rise in Chinese demand and partly also by increasing financial investments a commodity price boom also began in the early 2000s. And this reduced developing countries' external borrowing needs, but it also kind of, provided them with a lot of extra external resources that they could use domestically. So these kind of, broad systemic shifts explain the general slowdown in financial liberalization in the early 2000s. And also why many of the interventionist experiments faltered after 2013 when these financial and commodity booms kind of came to an end. But there still remains a lot of variation, of course, between countries, even during this period. So some developing countries took advantage of these very permissive external conditions between 2003 and 2013 to intervene in their financial sectors, while others didn't, right? So in countries with economically liberal governments where domestic pressures to increase control of the financial system were weak, it's not surprising in a way, right, that governments wouldn't do it. They would just continue with more of the same liberalization policies. But where these pressures to renationalize the financial sector was strong, whether as a result of popular mobilizations, labor unions, or industrial lobbying, policymakers that were reliant on these groups for support were more likely to try and reassert state control over credit allocation. And so, how am I doing for time?
I think just a few more minutes. Tell us about Bolivia.
Yes.
That's an incredible example.
So in the book, I kind of explain out of these subset of countries that have strong interventionist pressures why some managed to do it and some didn't. And so the cases in the book are Brazil and South Africa and Bolivia and Ecuador. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about Bolivia, which I can come back to in the Q&A as well. But Bolivia is really a fascinating case because it's like a very small peripheral country, and when you think of countries that do these kind of heterodox policies, it wouldn't be the first to come to mind. It was like a very heavily indebted country. It had a very deep, it had like financial shock therapy during the 80s, so it was very deeply liberalized. It was a very open, dollarized economy by the early 2000s and so on. So it was kind of surprising that you would see this happen in Bolivia of all places. But in 2013, Bolivia actually implemented one of the strongest kind of anti-private sector financial reforms, I'd say, globally. So it implemented these interest rate controls on private banks without compensation, which means that basically it told private banks you have to lend like 60% to this defined list of productive sectors of the economy, and it also capped the interest rates at which it could lend to these. So the private banks were obviously up in arms about this, right? Because it severely impacted on their profitability. And the World Bank and the IMF also were very much against this. So one of the chapters of the book focuses on, how was Bolivia able to do this? So part of it is, of course, what I spoke about before, these favorable external financial conditions. So Bolivia is a commodity exporting country. There was a commodity boom. But the key point, the key lesson from this case is that none of this is automatic. So in 2006, there was this, the Evo Morales government was elected to power. It's very kind of, leftist, with developmentalist leanings and promising kind of independence from the World Bank and IMF. And there were these very favorable external conditions as well. But this government very strategically used these external conditions to its own favor. So it basically, it first increased taxes on the multinational hydrocarbons companies. So had it not done this, it would never have benefited from the commodity boom in the same way. Then it used these, it used this increased revenue that was then flowing directly to the state to repay the IMF and World Bank loans early so that it could get free from these conditionalities. But then it was also scared that if it implemented very drastic financial reforms, there would be like domestic capital flight, domestic banks would stop lending, and some foreign banks threatened that they would exit if it, so they said they would relocate their branches abroad if there were any kind of reforms that brought instability to the economy. So because of that, they didn't do any of these reforms immediately. They kind of first launched this very gradual this gradual program of reducing the importance of the private sector in the economy. So they channeled commodity boom revenues to state-owned companies through the central bank, and they started building up a public banking system. And it was very strategic. So the government was thinking that eventually they wanted to be in the position where even if there was capital flight, even if the private banks stopped lending, they would be able to compensate with these public alternatives. And so they got to this point only in 2013, which is when they then implemented this very kind of drastic financial reform. So I'll end it there. I'll talk more about it in the Q&A, but I mean, so one key point is that it required a lot of strategic planning and reform, but in a way it was also dependent on external liquidity conditions. So it couldn't have happened without favorable external conditions, but favorable external conditions alone were not enough for the reform to happen.
And I just want to say there's a lot of indicators that it's a tool that really worked. In 2019, the Center for Economics and Policy Research declared that Bolivia had the fastest growing economy in South America over 5 years and had reduced poverty by 42% and extreme poverty by 60% since Evo Morales took office. So I don't know how the economy is doing now, but it's a hopeful sign that there are tools out there that are being used, and I'm very interested in whether developed countries could take some of these tools and use them. So, all right, Jazmin, take it away. Tell us about Brazil.
I wanted to start off by thanking Gary and Noam and Hannah for organizing this fantastic conference. It has been really amazing to be in a venue where everyone's speaking the same language, and we can just focus on kind of exchanging ideas about that language. I hope you forgive me for being so much of a political scientist that I'm going to be using slides today. You don't have to laugh that much, come on. So, the main point I want to make in this presentation is that if we're thinking about the global south, we have been beyond neoliberalism for a very long time. Maybe there was never such a thing as neoliberalism in the global south. So picking up on what Stefan said in his argument that states never really relinquished their control over markets, that the types of institutions and tools that they use to regulate markets have always been there, the global south is an example of that. So we all know that state-led development was the prevalent model of organizing economic activity across the developing world, largely between the 1950s and 1980s. And there has been a long line of great research that has shown how that legacy of state-led development impacted market reforms in two ways. That legacy had an ideational component and it had an institutional component. So ideationally, they were policymakers that continued to believe in structural development, meaning that they continued to believe that state intervention was necessary to achieve a transformation from low productivity activities to high productivity activities, meaning that they were creating incentives for labor and business to specialize in high skill and skill-intensive manufacturing and services. And that institutionally, they created organizations through which to implement those developmentalist ideas, the most important of which, as we know from Gershon work, Amsden, et cetera, are state-owned banks in which capital is used for creating productive investment purposes. And we know that that legacy impacted market reforms, and it has also been impacting the post-market reform period. And today I want to talk about the experience of Brazil in repurposing that state-led development legacy to take advantage of globalization. So when Lula da Silva, the historic leader of the labor-based Workers' Party, came to power in 2003, he called upon Brazilian businessmen to lose their fear of becoming multinational businessmen. Not exactly what you would expect from a left Workers' Party, right? And this idea, right, that you could use the state to incentivize your local firms to become multinational corporations is actually a widespread yet understudied phenomenon across late developers. So we know, right, that the development banks of the East Asian tigers use subsidized financing to support exports. But in the 1980s, they also began to use subsidized financing to support the outward investments of Japanese, Taiwanese, South Korean firms, especially in Europe and the United States. China has actually been trying to actively create Chinese multinational corporations since 1979, nearly 2 decades before they officially launched their Go Global policy. And some of the largest democracies of the world, like India, Malaysia, and also Brazil, actively use this policy as well. So why is it that we now are beginning to fully begin to understand this globalized industrial policy? Why were policymakers trying to actively finance the foreign acquisitions and greenfield investments of their national firms? The reason for this is that across the developing world, there continue to be developmentalist policymakers. So what do I mean by developmentalist policymakers? I mean policymakers that believe that their mission is to pursue the structural transformation of their economies, that this structural transformation can only be carried out through direct government intervention in order to create the incentives and constraints for business to invest in a way that is going to achieve this structural transformation. These developmentalist policymakers are also very wary of dependence on foreign knowledge and technology, so they are very set on having these homegrown companies that can have their own set of technology and knowledge without being dependent on foreign firms to carry this out. And they believe that the private sector is a partner in this search for structural transformation. So therefore, they are willing to provide public capital for private entrepreneurs to help achieve these state goals. Now, these developmentalist policymakers struggled as financial and productive globalization really took off in the 1970s and 1980s. How could they continue to pursue structural transformation when globalization was constraining their choices, their policy interventions, to a much greater degree in the past? So during the 1980s and 1990s, we have a search among policymakers in the developing world for novel forms of state intervention. And that required a process of epistemic and policy learning about how to be developmental under globalization. And one of the key policy innovations that policymakers in China and Brazil and India stumbled upon was that the state could create homegrown multinational corporations. Why were they interested in having nationally controlled MNCs? Because they believed that only having nationally controlled MNCs could allow them to have companies large and strong enough to avoid foreign takeovers by European and American multinational corporations, that these global multinational corporations were necessary to overcome the protectionist barriers in advanced economies. So for example, if a Chinese multinational corporation invests in the United States, it can overcome tariffs set on Chinese products produced in China. This is called tariff jumping. And that multinational corporations were also a key way of obtaining knowledge and technology from advanced economies. So we know that knowledge and technology isn't spread evenly across the world. It's usually clustered. Think about the biotech corridor between Cambridge and London, right, or Silicon Valley in California. So by allowing your own companies to invest in these key locations, they could be placed in more innovative ecosystems. They could even acquire companies with proprietary technology or advanced managerial practices. And so what they believed, right, is in order to have their national firms make these right kinds of foreign investments that would actually allow them to improve their foreign market and knowledge access, state intervention was necessary. And what kind of state intervention? Targeted state financing to these companies in order to pursue these outward, developmentally oriented investment opportunities abroad. So just to give you an example of what these policymakers' thinking look like, this is a quote from Luciano Coutinho. He's a well-known developmental economist in Brazil who was the president of the Brazilian National Development Bank. So he claimed that to overcome the competitive deficits of Brazil, we cannot do without a set of national groups with global capacity. Without them, we will not develop endogenous cores of technological progress capable of affirming Brazilian brands, creating new markets, and generating in Brazil high-quality activities and jobs. So once the Workers' Party came to power with this new updated developmental ideas about how to pursue state-led development under globalization, they had a very powerful institutional tool at their disposal, this institutional legacy of the golden period of state-led development, which was the Brazilian National Development Bank, or the BNDES in its Portuguese initials. Now, the BNDES was created in 1952, and it's the key provider of long-term capital for large Brazilian firms. So at the time that the Workers' Party came to power, it provided 60% of long-term investment capital to the largest 500 firms in the Brazilian economy, and it did so through two financial tools. It provided subsidized loans, but it also purchased equity in firms in order to capitalize these companies. And the BNDES was able to have this financial power because itself, it had varied financial sources. It had both domestic sources of financing and international sources of financing. So the BNDES obtained capital that it later relent to firms through transfers from the Treasury, compulsory saving mechanisms through payroll taxes, returns from its own investments in companies, loans from international organizations, and floating bonds in international markets. So this is a case, right, where a state-owned bank is both leveraging domestic and international capital market sources to achieve its developmental purposes. And the BNDES is also benefited from having this long-term bureaucracy with deep sectoral expertise, and it's widely considered in the literature as an island of bureaucratic excellence within the Brazilian state. Now, what the Workers' Party did was repurpose the BNDES to provide capital for the foreign acquisitions and greenfield investments of Brazilian firms abroad. It would co-finance these foreign investments. It would finance up to 60% of a particular foreign investment project through loans, and it would capitalize these firms by purchasing shares in these companies. The shares went from 0 to 40% in Brazilian multinational corporations, but the average equity stake was around 12%. But even this 12% stake came with a lot of power of the state over the firm's investment decisions. Why? Because when the BNDES provided equity, it signed a privileged shareholder agreement with the firms, allowing it to access proprietary information of the firm. It often negotiated a seat also at the administrative and fiscal board of the firm. And the BNDES decided to support Brazilian MNCs across a wide array of industries in which the country had a comparative advantage. Think about commodities or construction companies, and in sectors where the state wanted to create a comparative advantage. Think about tech or pharmaceuticals. Now, Farah has been pushing us to talk about what is the effects of the policies interventions that we are talking about. So let me just give you a sense of what were the effects of this globalized industrial policy in Brazil. So in this analysis, I'm taking 72 large multinational corporations, and I'm comparing the foreign investment trajectories of the multinational corporations that received BNDES financing against the multinational corporations that did not receive BNDES financing for their foreign investments. And I'm carrying out a difference in difference analysis. And here the key identification assumption is that the foreign investments of supported and non-supported firms are following parallel trends prior to the state's intervention. And if the state intervention is effective, we should see a break, a difference between supported and non-supported firms once they begin to receive government financing. And in the figure I'm showing you here, we see evidence that this holds. So across different metrics of how these multinational corporations invested abroad, we see positive effects of state financing on these multinational corporations. So in blue, we're going to have the supported firms, and in red, we're going to have the firms that didn't receive BNDES financing. So let's think first about market access. So firms that received government support invested on average in 2 more host countries than firms that didn't receive state support. So that amounts to about an 70% standard deviation. In terms of what did they achieve once they invested in these host countries, did they allow that to export to other markets? We also find that firms that received government support invested in host countries that themselves had signed more free trade agreements, allowing supported firms access to an average of 19 more free trade agreements than firms that did not have state support in their foreign investments. Now, we might also want to think about knowledge access, right? To what degree was investing abroad allowing these firms access to foreign knowledge and technology? So what we find is that firms that received state support invested in countries with innovation ecosystems that were about 21% higher than the innovation ecosystems of the countries where non-supported firms invested in. Now, this is a measure from the Atlas Harvard of Economic Complexity, which basically measures the economic complexity of these host countries. So substantively, that means going from investing in a country like France, that would be the type of country that non-supported firms invested in, to investing in a country like Germany, which is where the kind of country that supported firms invested in. Sorry if someone is French here. And finally, what I find is that supported firms were 36% more likely to actually have a research and development center abroad than non-supported firms, which is a nice measure of how intensively they were using these foreign innovation ecosystems. How am I doing on time, Farah?
A couple more minutes.
A couple of minutes. Yeah. So, what do these abstract measures actually mean, right, in terms of the market and knowledge access that a firm received, and how the BNDES helped the firm obtain these benefits? Let me walk you through quickly the example of Totus. So Totus is a software firm. It produces enterprise resource planning software for other firms to manage their information and production processes. And what this figure is showing us is how Totus invested abroad before and after BNDES financing. So before the company received financing from the Brazilian Development Bank, it was bankrolling its foreign investment strategy with a private equity firm. And this allowed the firm to invest in Argentina and Mexico, but according to my interviews with company managers, this financing strategy didn't allow them to carry out their preferred investment strategy, which was investing in the United States, particularly in Silicon Valley and in Europe. But once they began to receive BNDES financing through the bank buying company shares and by providing loans, they were able to have a subsidiary in Portugal that allowed them access to clients all throughout Europe and a research and development center in Silicon Valley. And what did this presence in Europe and the United States allow this company to do? Well, according to company managers, quite a lot. This allowed them to have direct access to local consumers, therefore tailoring their software to these foreign consumers in advanced economies. It allowed these foreign subsidiaries to serve as listening posts so the company itself could invest in tech startups, particularly around Silicon Valley. It allowed the company collaboration, co-producing software with foreign firms. For this company, it was particularly important that they began co-producing software with Google and Apple, which also then provided credibility to get higher tech clients. And more importantly, the firm itself had its own profit-oriented incentives to do an in-house transfer of skills and knowledge. So it would take its managers and engineers based in Sao Paulo, and it would have them do 6-month, 1-year stints in its Silicon Valley subsidiary, so they would be embedded in that environment. And it would take the employees that it had poached from other tech companies, particularly in that moment they were poaching a lot of employees from Yahoo, and bring them to Brazil in order to train their managers and engineers there. And according to my interviews with TOTU's managers, and I heard this story across my interviews with firms in different sectors of the Brazilian economy, BNDES financing was key for them to carry out their preferred investment strategy. So Alvaro Cisneros, the director of international market operators, tell me it is difficult to establish the counterfactual, right, of whether the company would have been able to internationalize without BNDES funding. You have to love a company manager that uses social science language, right, a counterfactual. He says, I don't know if we would have found an alternative source of capital. We wouldn't have been able to access the international market. So to conclude, right, this state provision of state investment capital enabled Brazilian firms greater access to foreign markets and knowledge. And this occurred in a context, right, where we wouldn't necessarily expect good industrial policy results for 2 reasons. First, it was a period of bad governance, wide corruption scandals by the Workers' Party government. And in my own research, I find evidence that there was some degree of political capture and that political donations to the Workers' Party affected which firms were actually receiving this funding. And the Brazilian Development Bank's policy of supporting global champions actually received a lot of domestic political backlash. But the BNDES was able to overcome these political obstacles because of the widespread and deep institutional capacity that the institution had acquired over 60 years, and particularly how shareholding in these firms provided a crucial lever of control and influence over these firms that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. So state-led development, it never really disappeared in many middle-income countries. So we have been beyond neoliberalism for decades in many parts of the developing world. And what this means is that there have been developmentalist-oriented policymakers that have influence over policymaking, and that the state continues to have this crucial lever of control over investment capital. But we also want to be aware of the crucial evolution that the state-led development model has engaged in all throughout neoliberalism, which in part explains its resilience and the success of many of these emerging economies. So one key difference now is that developing countries should no longer be thought of as importers of capital. They now account for 1/3 of global investments. And this internationalization of capital is not just a product, right, of the liberalization of markets, but it's a targeted government policy that is used to promote economic development. These state banks are increasingly being financialized in the sense that they are using financial tools for non-financial objectives, and that these state-led development models are much more savvy about using international capital markets to raise funds in order to pursue the kinds of policies that we would think go against the grain of international capital interests. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you so much.
One incredible fact that you taught me was that the portfolio of Brazil's National Development Bank is what, twice the size of the World Bank's?
Bolsonaro reduced it, but at the time it was 2% of GDP and twice the size of the World Bank.
And we're going to dig into more. Another big success in Brazil is JBS, the world's largest meat company, which is, it might ring a bell because they gave $5 million to Trump's inauguration, and shortly thereafter were listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But we'll get into that. All right, Marcos, bring us home. What are we learning about the future of the global economic order from all of this?
Thanks, Farah. I don't know where home is, but I'll try to. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry about that. I would like to thank Gary, Noam, Hannah, everyone involved in the organization of this event. It's great to be here. Thank you. I would very much like to talk about a country like Brazil, its dependent condition, the neo-extractive trap it's in. I'd like very much to talk about possible ways to widen its narrow margin of action. I know that Jazmin and Natalya would have a lot to say about that too, and we can discuss this in the Q&A if you wish. However, this discussion requires that to situate global South countries like Brazil within the broader context of the ongoing reorganization of global order. So I will dedicate my time to this issue today. This broader context is primarily defined by the success of neoliberalism in dismantling mechanisms of universal solidarity. This has intensified disputes over redistribution and solidified different social, economic, cultural, and political coalitions. In democratic countries like Brazil, I used to say still democratic countries like Brazil, the divide is between what I would call the fearless right, which is unafraid to ally itself with the far right, and a new progressivism. This is a genuine division, not mere polarization, because according to the metaphor, the two poles would belong to the same magnetic field, and that's not the case. These are two irreconcilable worldviews. Since, as I understand it, our shared objective at this conference is to diagnose the current situation, to help outline possible courses of action for the progressive camp, the first question I would like to ask is, why are we progressives paralyzed? Why is that? I don't mean we are not making different, innovative, and interesting proposals, quite the opposite. What I mean is that we are not being effective in opposing Trumpian-like coalitions. We are not converging toward not a common program, but a common horizon that will allow for experimentation in different countries, in different regions. Why is that? In my view, the underlying assumption paralyzing the progressive camp today is the belief that the current reconfiguration of the global order is reversible. Either that or it will necessarily fail, which amounts to the same idea. I think this is an extremely risky position. Maybe Stefan would rightly stress that historical analogies and pendulum metaphors are really to be taken with caution. However, I think that if history teaches us anything, is that there is little time to formulate a new progressive program and build a coalition in support of it. Elections and democratic institutions still exist, albeit with visible fragilities. We must take advantage of them while we still can. However, if we want to stop the regression, we must change our attitude and act quickly. This change in attitude would entail recognizing the reorganization of the global order as irreversible. It would mean treating today's significant geopolitical trend as an established order. It's urgent to do that because historical experience shows a connection between the rise of far-right coalitions, the destruction of democratic institutions, and war. The reorganization is less about Trump, what Trump did, and more about what his initiatives revealed. Global governance and multilateralism have been dysfunctional for quite some time. Trump's initiatives revealed how global coordination actually functioned under the previous order's veil. In short, this essentially corresponds, in my view, to the current balance of power in the United Nations Security Council. Trump's initiatives have made this correlation of forces official in the form of a new order. The progressive elite in positions of power within international institutions have been well aware of these dysfunctions. Since at last the early 2020s, they have been proposing a concerted reform from above of the international order, a new Bretton Woods, as it has been called. If Trump's second election did not make this project seem unrealistic, then it should at least prompt an acknowledgement that it's no longer feasible. To acknowledge this is to recognize two standout trends in the new configuration. Recognizing these trends will necessitate significant tactical retreats for progressive forces. The first trend is that no country will be able to maintain any degree of autonomy, including if democracy will still be there or not, without a military defense capability. The second trend is that most countries will not stop overexploiting natural resources, including fossil fuels, anytime soon. Progressives face two possible courses of action in the face of these trends. The first is to increase social mobilization to stop the arms race and reach voluntary global environmental agreements, such as the 2015 Paris Agreement. This approach corresponds to a possible source of paralysis for the progressive movement, as I previously identified. Another possible course of action is a tactical retreat to a position of damage control. This position assumes that the new geopolitical and military landscape has solidified the notion that the energy transition will be achieved by further exploiting mineral and fossil resources. It acknowledges that the energy transition is currently a byproduct of the technological race. Consequently, this position would entail imposing strict limitations and conditions on the exploitation of mineral resources and fossil fuels. The additional revenues would be used exclusively for an ecological transition guided by the fight against inequalities. Consequently, if organized social forces opposing the arms race are unable to stop it, as seems likely today, the primary objective would be to prevent the current arms race from escalating into actual wars. These goals are far less ambitious than what's necessary to prevent environmental collapse and the continuation of the arms race. Nevertheless, they are already extremely challenging under current conditions. However, they could be important milestones in developing a new progressive horizon adapted to the current balance of power. With this in mind, I will now discuss my perception of the main features of the ongoing reorganization of the world order. The current dismantling of multilateralism and global governance points to a reorganization in terms of three neo-imperialist blocs, one led by the United States, one by China, and one by the European Union. In this scenario, it's unclear whether Europe will remain united as a bloc. However, if it does, it could function as a buffer bloc, which could be important in preventing widespread wars. The emerging new imperialism differs from previous forms of imperialism in many ways. First, it is post-colonial. Not post-colonial in a good sense. Rather, it's neo-imperialism that emerged after the decolonization processes of the second half of the 20th century. Along with the dissolution of the Soviet bloc, these processes resulted in the 193 countries we have today compared to the 51 countries in 1945. Another major difference from the 1945 arrangement is the formation of the European Union. An even more recent change is Europe's decoupling from the US in defense matters, which seems irreversible to me. Compared to 1945, the reorganized new imperial powers now deal with peripheries that have formed coalitions and interstate organizations. This gives peripheral countries room to maneuver toward effective, non-aligned self-organization. As Jayati mentioned yesterday, periods of instability, not chaos, let's say stability, may encourage experimentation, particularly in forming new coalitions. However, peripheral countries will certainly be aware of the risks that to do this kind of new coalitions under the current circumstances. Size matters, and it matters a lot. Size is not only about economic and military power, but also about territorial extension, population, demographic trends, and access to critical resources for the ongoing technological and arms race. The main threat is annexation by larger countries, whether formal or informal. Even if the objects are lowered, the search for global agreements in forums like the UN or the G20 should continue. At the same time, this search should not prevent smaller pacts from forming. They may even include several countries. In fact, ongoing geopolitical realignment makes it reasonable to assume that solid alliances among groups of countries will be necessary before global agreements can be reached. This could be called sub-globalization, to fit into the theme of the panel. As deglobalization continues, it is possible that globalization could assume a form of globalization within blocks of countries. This new form could favor the formation of country blocks that would grant preferences or access privileges to parties of these agreements. In conclusion, I want to acknowledge that the change in attitude I'm talking about requires addressing many contradictions. These contradictions result from tactical retreats like the ones I described. We must address them head-on and without evasion. Trumpian-like coalitions have their contradictions too, but they do not stem from the core principles of a potential progressive program. The contradictions of the different camps in contention today distinguish them. We must address ours. Thank you.
All right, we're going to have a bit of a discussion up here between us, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. So I'm struck by the tools that that you're bringing to us and how they were opposed by the Bretton Woods institutions, even though ultimately they showed a lot of success. And I'm curious if you see attitudes changing, you know, at the World Bank and the IMF towards these kinds of tools, given that they have proven to be successful. Are you seeing a shift? I almost sometimes think that it's like when a country does exactly what the World Bank tells them to do, it doesn't succeed, and it's the countries that push back and develop their own tools that actually have shined. So I guess I'm curious whether whether you can speak more broadly on whether attitudes have changed and really what is to become of the World Bank and sort of these international institutions that are so sort of discredited in this era. What should happen to these institutions? And so maybe yeah, but yes, into the microphone.
So I think this view has actually been around for quite a long time, that the IMF and the World Bank have changed their attitudes towards, not just towards these kind of like specific financial tools, but more broadly towards like capital controls, inequality, so on. So I actually don't think this is correct. So I think there's a lot of these kind of research papers coming out from the IMF that are very, like not in keeping with what they've said in the past. And because of that, I think people think that their attitudes towards interventionist policy tools, industrial policies, and so on has changed. But I think the only way to like really know is to look at their actual program conditionalities. And if you look at their recent program conditionalities, it hasn't actually changed at all. There's a lot of work by Alexander Kentikalenis and co-authors showing this, that the actual program conditionalities have not changed. So until those change, I think it's, like they've maybe changed in rhetoric, but that's not as important as what the actual program conditionalities are.
I'd love to hear others jump in and jump in to say, sort of address that larger question of what should happen to them. Do you think the Bretton Woods institutions will just sort of fade away and become irrelevant? Do you think they can change to be fit for purpose in today's world? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what should happen to them.
Well, maybe I can jump in just there and give a historical perspective on this again. I mean, the IMF wasn't always what it became in the 1980s, and it wasn't even always what it was in 1944. The idea for this institution emerged in the 1930s in discussions among Eastern European and Latin American indebted countries in the crisis of the Great Depression, who called for something like a currency normalization fund, internationally capitalized, the idea of which was you tide over a balance of payments crises periodically in a kind of benign, good-natured way, so you don't have to depend on private creditors that wouldn't allow you to do that. And this actually had some input in the Bretton Woods discussions, and how the IMF then became this punitive organization by the 1980s is, of course, a question of, political history. And I think that's sort of the answer to where we're headed. I think it's very telling what we heard from Jazmin, and this is obviously known that countries increasingly think twice about going to the IMF. Maybe you have a better deal, comparatively speaking, with China. So in that sense, this is how I think this trajectory is going to be decided.
Anyone else?
Yes, I agree with Natalya. I think she's absolutely right. I mean, there's been a change in ideas, right, in terms of kind of re-embracing state control over markets, capital controls, industrial policy, et cetera. And you saw some thinking at the top of the World Bank especially, and a little bit towards the IMF, especially in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. But it doesn't have a lot of bite because, as Natalya said, it hasn't really affected conditionalities. What has had bite is that these countries have had these alternative funding sources. mostly from Chinese state-to-state lending and somewhat from these new multilateral banks, the kinds of institutions that Marcos was talking about. So these institutions now, these international organizations face kind of a double threat from within, with its main shareholder, the United States, increasingly reticent to support them, and these external threats of these competition from these other international organizations. So I think, it's the internal threat, right? And the key question of whether the United States is going to continue with some other key shareholders to capitalize these institutions in the same way that I think is going to determine the future of these organizations.
Marcos, do you want to say a few words, or?
Just that these are very important organizations, of course, and we have to try to make the deals that we can make. But the idea that they can be reformed, I think it's gone. And this is tragic, of course, but this is the reality. So what can the IMF or even the UN, what can they become? Given the limits and the correlation of forces that we have. That's why you have BRICS, that's why you have other ways of organizing trade flows and agreements. And I think we should use all these institutions at the same time. But I think that the project of reforming Bretton Woods is gone.
So one underlying question that we've wrestled with before this panel is the idea of what's a healthy relationship between the state and capital. Like, what should it look like versus what it looks like now? And I mean, this Brazilian example is fascinating because they essentially created, or boosted this meat company, which is the largest meat company in the world. In one way, this is an incredible success, right? They created a global champion that is now like, if you've eaten meat in the United States, you've interacted with this company. It's huge. It's so big that it can't be ignored, and that the U.S. Congress can't really get its arms around. It's accused of corruption and a lot of things. So I guess I want to put that question out there about what in a healthy society, what should the relationship be? Is it the government disciplining capital? Should capital retain some kind of power? But this particular example makes me question whether those of us who are cheering on these tools might also be inadvertently creating a monster, or is there a risk that these tools might also create something that's too big to control, or opening the doors to corruption in a certain way? So I don't know. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Yes, I mean, what is the typical criticism of state intervention, right? That you favor companies over other interests, particularly labor and consumers, right? The distributional consequences, and that this creates problems of political capture, right? And JBS is a perfect example of this because you created this company that, is extremely powerful. It was part of one of the largest corruption schemes in Brazilian history. And it has power not only within Brazil, but globally, right? It's the largest employer in Ireland, for example. So this clearly creates problems, and they are extremely difficult to solve. There are obviously, to the extent that you can have good institutional environments The literature shows that ideally, if you have like this combination of this embeddedness between the state and firms in order to extract information from firms about what is needed, but you're able to somehow maintain that autonomy because you have a meritocratic bureaucracy, because you pay them high salaries, because you're able to create career incentives among that bureaucracy in order to kind of isolate themselves from those pressures, then you are more likely to get these good developmental results. But if you look at the East Asian developmental cases, which we consider kind of the gold standard of state-led development, corruption was always a problem. Crony capitalism was always a problem. So I think what history shows is that, you know, you're going to see some bad with the good that's going to come with state intervention.
I would like to add very quickly that the president of JBS is now saying that he is a candidate for the next elections. So you see how the relations, which direction relations go between state and society. And I would say it depends in the sense that are we talking about a democratic rule or an authoritarian rule? Because in this new world, you cannot have the way, as Stefan was showing, this naive idea that you will just spread democracy all over the world. You have to deal with countries that are authoritarian. My own country is threatened by authoritarianism. So it would very much depend, and it would depend also if the dollar stays has the position that it has today or not. That's another question for this relation between state society.
I have a follow-up question for Jazmin based on this. But,
Can you say it into the microphone?
oh, sorry, yeah. But so I would have thought that the kind of stuff you were talking about, right, that like BNDES retains this kind of seat on the board, and then it, like, with its loans, it can very carefully monitor the company and so on. Like, isn't that exactly the kind of thing you need to control these big companies? So, like, why didn't it work in this case?
Well, it depends, I guess, what you mean by control, right? So the BNDES was able to use, right, these tools of influence within firms to steer their investment decisions. And so, for example, after the corruption scandal exploded in Brazil and JBS was in the limelight, the company actually wanted to take its headquarters away from Brazil as part of shielding itself from the judicial probe. And because the BNDES had a seat at the company board and its shareholder agreement, it was able to veto that decision and keep such a large, global, powerful firm in Brazil. So in that sense, that was the state being able to discipline capital, but it wasn't able to discipline its political activity, right? And particularly the political activity that's not legal. So the kinds of under-the-radar corruption that occurred.
But then do you see the same kinds of things happening with these state-owned national champions, like Petrobras? Like, did they also have the same kind of like political? Oh, sorry. So if the national champions are state-owned, does that make any difference, do you think?
Well, a difference in what way?
In terms of being able to better control their political activities.
Well, yes, so state-owned enterprises are not allowed to carry out campaign donations, right? And because their top management is appointed by the state, it's politically aligned. So it's a completely different logic, right? These companies can be used for political purposes, right? Rather than these companies generating political meddling. So it's, I think, a different logic when it comes to state-owned enterprises.
I also just wanted to hear you say one beat about South Africa, because there's a lot going on in Africa, and just one beat.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a really great case to compare with Brazil, both in terms of what we were talking about earlier and like reasserting state control over finance, but also what you were just saying, because in South Africa, actually, the large companies did move their headquarters abroad, and the government didn't do anything to stop them. So it's in a way, like what happened in Brazil might be politically problematic, but what happened in South Africa was so much worse. So I think in a way, Brazil was somewhat successful compared to South Africa in disciplining these large firms. In terms of reasserting state control over finance, so Brazil is a really, South Africa is a really interesting comparison for Brazil because they're quite similarly structured economies. They both benefited from very similar favorable external conditions, so mainly financial market liquidity. But in South Africa, the domestic financial sector was able to convince policymakers that if they kind of funded these huge development banks, like happened in Brazil, there would be irreversible capital flight, and it would be a national economic disaster. So I mean, in my kind of research, the case just shows that these outcomes are not always predetermined. Like sometimes it just depends on how effective the domestic financial sector is at convincing policymakers and what policymakers' perceptions are of how vulnerable the economy is to capital flight. So given very similar structural conditions, in South Africa, the domestic financial sector was successful in making policymakers back off.
All right, this is going to be my last question, then we're going to just go to the audience here. To what extent can developed nations, like can the United States turn to these tools? Do we need a national development bank in the U.S.?
Yes.
We have 10 minutes left for the session.
Oh, no. I thought we had a little bit more time. Okay, I apologize. Let's go to questions. Sorry about that. Can we start with you? Introduce yourself and say your question.
Farah, maybe take 3 questions.
Yep.
So, hi, I'm Phil Longman. I'm the policy director of the Open Markets Institute, which works competition policy issues in Washington.
Can you louder?
Sorry. Phil Longman, Open Markets Institute. I have a question that wants to build on the discussion of crony capitalism and also bring in entrepreneurship. So in the United States, it looks like as the neoliberal order crumbles, what's replacing it in practice is world historical crony capitalism. And I just shudder to think what would happen if Trump actually had a sovereign wealth fund to play with. So one question has to do with how much is the political economic culture of the United States and institutional history of the United States prepared to accommodate the kind of temptations that would accompany greater executive power over the direction of capital in the United States. My other question is, the discussion of Brazil particularly, is about, well, isn't it great we created this national champion? And I'm sure it is, but it also has effects on competition downstream for new starts and for entrepreneurial in general. In the United States, that company is devastating American ranchers because of its monopolization of the meatpacking industry. It's horrible what it's doing to the local farming in the United States. So one theory of change on economic development is you want a vibrant entrepreneurial sector, and if it's been competing with state-sponsored enterprises, that's not a good thing. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that.
Can we get another question? And right here, and then we'll go very far in the back for a question.
So I'm Cheryl Jacobs. I'm a journalist at the Daily Telegraph. Hopefully you can hear me. You can't hear me. Okay, much louder.
Just put it right up to your mouth.
This mic is working. So actually, though I think there is a temptation to focus on the continuities between Trumpism and neoliberalism, from my perspective, there are some interesting parallels between Trumpism and some of the ideas that have been tossed around today. So this desire to move away from or diversify the foundations of American hegemony away from purely financial power to industrial power, and J.D. Vance has said some interesting things about the dollar supremacy not actually serving ordinary Americans. And also in protectionism, the revival of a development model from the 50s and 60s of import substitution, I think is quite interesting, whether or not you think that it's viable, but they have plucked a development-based idea and want to apply it to America. And wanting to pursue an economic trajectory which both serves finance and industry at the same time. And I think that Trump's plan to devalue the dollar is quite interesting in that respect, because it serves both manufacturers in an ideal sense, but also Bitcoin billionaires. So you see something quite interesting happening. I mean, what is your view on Trumpism? Do you see it as just neoliberalism 2.0, or do you see that the right is moving away from neoliberalism as well, and therefore how would you distinguish progressive neoliberalism from Trumpist neoliberalism?
All right, can we have somebody take the microphone to the yeah. All right.
Richard Johnson, Queen Mary University of London. On this panel about remaking globalization, we've heard a lot about controls over the movement of capital, but I wanted to ask about controls on the movement of labor. For example, the extreme case, you might look at China, where China has very rigid controls both on immigration but also internal labor movement. And I wondered if in the cases of your expertise, whether the control on labor movement, whether that's cross-border or internally, is that all part of the story?
All right, who wants to jump in on those three?
I can start with, I guess, the entrepreneurship.
Can you get closer to the microphone? Thanks.
I can start by just saying something about the entrepreneurship question while I gather my thoughts on the other questions. So I think that, I guess the challenge for developing countries is that if they rely on just these like small firms, they can't be globally competitive. So it's like that's the whole idea behind the national. As Jazmin's better able to say than me, but the whole idea is that if you're not globally competitive, your domestic industries will just be outcompeted. So in a way, like they have to, it's like the nature of the global system is such that it forces developing countries into these kind of strategies.
Can somebody address the crony capitalism?
I can say something about Trumpism and crony capitalism. Well, is Trumpism post-neoliberalism? It's a mixed bag. I think if we pick out one particular, sort of key item of the developmental paradigm, which is disciplining capital, it seems to me that, yes, political culture in the US and the institutional legacy does not make me particularly optimistic that, the United States has the institutional guts, if you want, to perform this kind of discipline. It's also I think a question of political culture. Just one example that comes to mind from Trump, from the first Trump administration is Operation Warp Speed and the development of the COVID vaccines. It's not very well known that actually, this is typical of the United States, statutorily on the books, the federal government has the right to in fact, force companies that patent innovations that are partially dependent on public funding to force companies to commercialize them and make them available to essentially socialize them. Part of the agreement of Operation Warp Speed was that the federal government under Trump, even though this was otherwise a success, signed away that right explicitly as part of the deal. I think that's a very telling example of essentially state capacity being willingly abdicated. So it makes me not particularly, optimistic that this core mechanism will be exercised or can be developed institutionally very easily, though ultimately it depends, on the balance of political forces, yes.
Gary, do we have time for three more?
We have time for one more.
One more question out there.
Take two more.
Two more questions out there, and then we'll as people answer them, can be their final thoughts. All right, right there. Yep. And then bring the microphone out to one of these gentlemen.
Thanks for the great panel. I have, sorry, I'm Anush Kapadia from IIT Bombay. Comments and thoughts on all of them, but in the interest of time. Jazmin, two questions. One, the tech transfer story, super interesting, super important, of course, for Global South firms. Market access and access to these ecosystems, that's an interesting measure. One other measure I could think of is sort of good old-fashioned import substitution, right? To what extent are these firms actually moving up the value chain and entering into areas that were sort of otherwise reserved for higher tech global north firms? And secondly, you mentioned this in passing about the state-owned banks or banking system in general. I feel like we shouldn't talk too much about BNDES to the global north. They might steal all the secrets because it's such a wonderful institution. But you know, the global financial discipline piece, right? You know, it seems like this is a world. Is Brazil doing capital controls in a particular way? Is the funding secured? You know, is it sort of isolated from these international financial rigors? Like, how are they able to? How is this funding piece? Of course, it's long-term capital, but then there's a broader context of global financial subordination, if you like. So how does that fit into your story? Thanks.
All right, could we get the microphone to this gentleman up here?
Very quick, on the import substitution versus export discipline as modeled by Korea and China, I strongly urge you to read the Bennett working paper, Bennett Institute, Diane Coyle's Institute's working paper by Fuad Hasanoff and Rene Sharif of the IMF, of all places, which does a very strong analytical take on how import substitution has worked much less well in terms of driving development than export discipline subsidy for development as in East Asia.
All right, so I think maybe let's go down the line. Final thoughts and reactions to these comments. Can each of you just say some final thoughts and?
Yes, I want to give a shout out to another paper by Aris Magor, which she makes the opposite case to what you just said. The thing about export orientation is that it serves really two purposes, you know, and I think these are big advantages that the national champions or the export-oriented companies that you nurture and support and force to export have to be globally competitive, which, you know, forces them to innovate in a certain way. But it also, I think this is also crucial and often forgotten, it brings in the foreign exchange, it breaks the foreign exchange constraint, which is often lethal for developing countries, you know, trajectories. So I think that's of course what's absolutely key here. But the picture is not as clear cut as Magor, what is it, 2023 will tell you.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, just also that, you know, import substitution always occurred at the same time as export-oriented industrialization. So I don't think the two are necessarily in conflict with one another.
I want to go briefly back to how Trump policies compare to some of the strategies we've been talking about today, because I think that's a fascinating question. Because basically what we're seeing in the United States today is this idea that now the United States has to do catch-up economic policies once again. But the Trumpism is doing it in a particular way, which is that it's doing basically restriction from the global economy. So they're doing FDI protectionism, which we don't talk about enough, and they're doing trade protectionism. And the missing part when we look at kind of strategies that have worked globally and historically in the United States is capacity building, right? Actually doing targeted industrial policy, creating institutions and tools for the state to intervene in this way. And that was there under the Biden administration, but it's not under Trump. So they're trying to do these catch-up industrial policies with one hand tied behind their back if they're not trying to kind of do this institutional capacity building. So regarding the global financial discipline question, how does BNDES and the Brazilian state get around it? There's a long history of BNDES diversifying its financial sources, using both domestic financial sources. So the key one is basically taking money from labor and rechanneling that to capital through compulsory savings programs, so basically taxes on payrolls. And that has been a huge source of BNDES funding. And so, how do they address capital flight? So So the Workers' Party has implemented capital controls, particularly after the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. But the main way that the Bendies has dealt with capital flight is by actually trying to turn outward investments not into a problem of capital flight, but into a solution for a developmental problem. So basically trying to direct the kinds of outward investments that these firms were carrying out and using its power within the company boards to direct the investments in these ways. We can talk more about it later.
All right. Final words?
Given time limitations, I just agree with my fellow panelists.
So let's have this be a beginning of a conversation rather than the end. Keep these people in mind. Come talk to them afterwards. And thank you all for attending this panel.